Hello, this is Scherable. I'm your host, Bill Scher. This is a Scherable history episode. Did FDR's attempt at court packing work? I feel like if you've heard about FDR's attempt to expand the court, uh, there's sort of two narratives that are out there. One is that it was a political disaster, it was unpopular, and it failed to clear Congress and become law. The alternative narrative is that he lost the battle but won the war because the Supreme Court, which had been striking down his New Deal legislation, had signaled that the federal government didn't have the power that he wanted it to. FDR wanted it to have. The court flipped and began giving him more favorable rulings, and so the attempt at court packing did what it set out to do and made the Supreme Court more compliant. And I want to explain what actually happened. And as I will, you will see that there are elements of truth in both of these narratives. And understanding what happened is very important to understanding what would be possible today. So in 1936, FDR won re-election with the biggest share of the popular vote in history to date. It was 61%. And it was, on its surface, an enormous mandate, but FDR took it perhaps farther than he should have, as historian Kenneth Davis said in the book FDR Into the Storm, which I happen to have right here and is a source for some of what I'm talking about today. He wrote, FDR was brought closer than ever before to an actual identification of himself with the power he wielded as God's chosen instrument. So he didn't run on packing the court, but he concluded, I'm effectively God's chosen instrument. If I want to start my second term by packing the court, the people are going to be with me. So he put together a plan, released it in early February of 1937, and the Supreme Court in late March had a ruling in a minimum wage law case, a case involving the minimum wage law of Washington State. And even though the court had struck down a minimum wage law in New York State just a year prior, they upheld this one from Washington State, and that is known as the switch in time that saved nine. So after this happened, a number of FDR's allies said, hey, you don't have to go forward with this now. You've already won. But FDR insisted on going forward anyway, and it was unpopular in the polls. In June, the Senate Judiciary Committee wrote a report that was deeply unfavorable. FDR pushed on it anyway, took it to the floor of the Senate, and 70 senators voted to send it back to committee, where it was essentially gutted, and a different bill was passed in a wholly different form. So the thing that's missing in that narrative, and the narrative that bolsters the argument that FDR won the war by doing so, is the Supreme Court actually had made the switch in December 1936, not March 1937. The vote on the Washington State minimum wage case, this case was called Parrish. The New York State minimum wage case was called Topalgo. It was a 4-4 ruling in chambers in December 1936, which was sufficient to uphold the Washington State law. It would have left a lower court ruling as is, but they wanted it to be 5-4. A justice was out sick. They knew that he would vote for. He would vote to uphold the Washington State law. So they waited until he was well. And in the interim, FDR comes out with his court packing proposal. The Supreme Court then waits a little bit longer. They did not want it to seem like they were responding immediately after that proposal. But to the public, it looked like it was a reaction to what FDR did. Now, that's not the end of the story, the end of the debate, because there was speculation in the air. FDR didn't run on court packing in 1936, but there was chatter about it. There was some discussion about it in the press that it could happen, and the Supreme Court was aware of that fact. So you could argue that the justice that switched, was one justice that switched, Owen Roberts, that Owen Roberts felt that political pressure and wanted to avert and undercut the support for court packing, and so wanted to switch. Now, Owen Roberts never admitted to that being the case. He always denied that he switched at all. He didn't accept the premise that his vote to strike down the New York State minimum wage law and to uphold the Washington State minimum wage law, he never accepted the premise that that constituted a switch. Now, if you read what I'd say most historians have to say about it, and I'll tell you, I've read this. This is where I first got keyed on to the chronology here. Kenneth Davis's FDR Into the Storm, 1937 to 1940. That's the fourth of his 5 FDR books, which are very, very ridiculous. If you really want to know about FDR, he has an angle like a lot of historians do, but you'll still get a lot of information out of it. There also, if you want to go really deep into it, there is a issue of the magazine, the American Historical Review, volume 110, issue 4. That was published in October 2005. There are several essays on the question if FDR's court packing provoked the switch or not. You'll get a lot of detail if you read those series of essays. And there's also a book by Jeff Schessel called Supreme Power. I know I haven't read that entire book. I've only dipped into it, but it draws from that series of historical essays. So the upshot of all this is that the historians basically believe, generally speaking, that Owen Roberts' explanation for his switch doesn't really hold water. It's not a believable story that he tells, and that's why most historians believe that he was influenced by the speculation and did feel that political pressure to switch. So what should that tell us about the political value of doing something so aggressive, of challenging institutional norms by proposing court packing? Well, what I get out of it, my personal takeaway is that, and this is an old chess adage, the threat is stronger than the execution. The threat of court packing appears to have had political impact on the Supreme Court and prompted a key judge to shift and recalibrate his ideological outlook. The execution, the actual proposal of packing the court, did not have that same impact. It had a very negative impact. It was unpopular. And there was a Gallup poll taken shortly after the proposal, but before the Supreme Court ruling had occurred, that already showed a majority of the country was against it. Those numbers got worse after the switch. And FDR's stubbornness in pursuing it anyway weakened his relationship with the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. The political parties at that time were not as ideologically pure as they are right now. And mind you, the Democratic Party in 2020, I'm talking in October of 2020, before the presidential election, Democratic Party is pretty ideological big tent at this point. It's not, the conservative wing is not as conservative as it was in 1937, but there is some ideological diversity. Those conservative Democrats were already not thrilled with the New Deal and were looking for an opening to oppose FDR. And with court packing, they got it in spades. They fought FDR vociferously. They beat him on his first big proposal out of the box in his second term. FDR took it very poorly and tried to purge conservative Democrats in the 1938 midterms. That failed. And so conservative Democrats were in a effective alliance with Republicans for the rest of his presidency until you get to World War II, when there's a different sense of national unity. But it essentially puts the kibosh on any more big ticket New Deal items, because FDR lost his political capital by pursuing court packing as aggressively as he did. So we're talking now in October 2020. If you're watching this down the line, what Joe Biden may or may not do, assuming he's elected president of the United States, will be more known to you than it is to me at this present moment. But it would seem to me that Biden being newly coy on the subject has political value. Having the threat in the air could maybe wouldn't produce a switch like it did in 1937, but might constrain a 6-3 Supreme Court, 6-3 conservative Supreme Court from taking things as far as they might like, because they would be nervous about the backlash that could develop. And it might prompt some Republican senators to be a little more collaborative with the President Biden and not as obstructionist for fear of what might happen in the future. Whereas actually proposing it might expose that it's not as popular as some might have thought. And then you've lost the political capital, you've lost the power of the threat. Anyway, that's my takeaway from all this. I encourage you to do your own reading on the subject with the FDR Into the Storm, with Supreme Power, with that series of essays in the American Historical Review published in October 2005. If you have your own thoughts, please leave them in the comments. Please subscribe to more shareable content on my YouTube channel. And if you wish to contribute financially, you can go to patreon.com/BillScher, BILLSCHER. Thanks so much. We'll be back with another episode of Scherable real soon. Take care.